Welcome back, everyone. We are again going to hear from our economist of choice. I'm Charlie Matthews. I am with Empowering Pumps and Equipment. I'm the CEO, and I am the one that gets to interview these people on a regular basis. But today, I'm actually going to turn it over to Alex to talk about the economic and labor update that we're having. We did a series one already, so if you haven't seen that, go back and take a look. More of that macro level there. And so, Alex, I'll turn it over to you, Alex, and let you take it from here.
Sounds great, Charlie. Thank you so much. And welcome everyone to this second episode in the Economic and Labor Market Update series, where we're going to focus on the industrial side of the US economy, kind of the B2B space. And I want you to understand that things are not always what they seem in the industrial landscape. So let's start at the series that is most indicative of the world around you, how you're feeling, what you're experiencing in your business, which is US industrial production. It includes three key elements. It's mining, manufacturing, and utilities. And as you can see here, if you were to look at the industrial production data at like face value, particularly when done on a 12-month moving total basis, things look pretty rosy. We had a record high in industrial production as of January of 2023. But it's important to remember that this is like, I'll use the analogy of a person, for example. So this is like the outward appearance of a person. This is what their hair looks like today. Are they wearing their makeup? What their outfit of choice looks like. What you really care about when assessing this data is not the outward appearance, but rather the vital signs of the person. And in order to get a good reading on an individual's blood pressure, heart rate, cholesterol, you can't do that by just looking at them, right? You have to do some testing. And so the testing, when it comes to economic data, essentially converts this top line volume or revenue associated numbers into rates of change. And so when I look at the same data for US industrial production, but on a rate of change basis, what you can see here is a fairly substantially different story that emerges. Yes, we may be at near record levels of activity on a 12-month moving total basis, but in terms of rates of change, the US industrial economy is starting to show cracks, and it's starting to show substantial weakening relative to where we were in even late 2022. So what you see here in this chart, two different rates of change. The orange line represents the quarter over quarter growth rate. The dark blue line is the year over year rate of change. And there's an interesting relationship that exists between these two in the sense that the shorter term growth rate, the orange line, tends to lead or predict what's going to happen in the darker line by about 3 to 6 months, depending on which period of data you're looking at. So about 2/4 of future insight can be gained just by looking at the two rates of change. And as you can see here, we had a very robust, very substantial peak. I mean, higher than anything that we had ever seen, certainly in the last 20 years, on the quarterly graph here on the orange line. This happened back in late 2001, early 2022, and it started to slow. It slowed to right around the 5% growth from nearly 15% growth. And then over recent months, that deceleration has gained momentum. And as you can see, on a quarterly basis, so comparing the last 3 months of industrial activity to the same 3 months from a year ago, we're up just 0.7%. Year over year, we're still in the 3% growth range, which is good, especially when you consider where that, how that compares to historic precedent. But the fact that this orange line now is substantially below the blue line means that we're going to see that deceleration or the decline in that blue line continue over the next 1 to 2 quarters. So as we get into the latter part of 2023. And if we look at an even shorter time frame, we can see that the month over month rate of change, which is actually not in this chart, but it is shown here in this next chart. The same data, inclusive of that month over month growth rate, that's actually already gone into negative territory. It's crossed through the zero line and is at, I believe, negative 0.2 as of the month of March. And so it is really important to understand that that is essentially a preview of things to come. And one of the main reasons why economists such as myself are expecting that there is likely going to be some recessionary activity in the US industrial economy as we get into the latter part of this year and into early 2024. Now, don't let that scare you for two reasons. Number one, we're coming off of levels, as I said, record highs and really unprecedented disconnect between the demand for industrial products and the ability of companies to supply those products due to either certain trade-related events or more particularly to supply chain constraints like the lack of availability of certain components and materials, whether it's due to the war or just because of the surge in demand and the supply not being able to keep up with that, the lack of availability of workers at the production facilities. I mean, any number of reasons, but the fact of the matter is we were in an environment in the industrial economy over the course of 2021 and 2022 that was not going to be sustainable for an extended period of time. So we're going through a realignment, as I see it right now. We're going through something that is, although painful in the short term, is actually good for the industrial economy in the long term because it's going to rebalance that supply and demand. It's going to get us back to normal operating conditions, hopefully for industrial companies such as yourselves, and allow you to catch your breath a little bit, to catch up on some of those backlogs that I hear many of you are telling me are still 2 years plus in some cases, right? And allow you to serve your customers better so that they don't have to just order on what's available right now. They can actually get the products and services that they need to meet their applications and their challenges. So while, again, it's not going to be a pleasant thing to go through this mild downturn that we're expecting in the third and fourth quarter of this year and likely into the first quarter of next year as well, it is something that's going to give you an opportunity to assess your business, to catch up from all of the robust growth that I'm sure you experienced over the last 2 years, and ask yourself, how do I position my business to take advantage of the next opportunity, the next leg up that is going to be more sustainable and healthier and is likely to manifest itself in mid to late 2024 and last well into 25 and likely beyond that as well. So think about this as an opportunity to use a calmer period in your company's operation to really be strategic, not necessarily as reactive as you have been over the last 2 years, but more proactive in terms of asking yourself, what do I need to have in place? What kind of people, what kind of capacity, what kind of assets do I need to really make sure that I focus on and have in place in order to position my business to take advantage of the next growth opportunity, which is likely about 12 months away as we speak now in the second quarter of 2023. It also, looking at the data in this manner, allows you to identify areas that perhaps are not going to be subject to the same kind of decline as the overall industrial sector. And I'm giving you an example of one of those areas here. I'm plotting the quarter-over-quarter growth rate for industrial production in the blue line versus the quarter-over-quarter growth rate for defense and space equipment. So think of this as representative of the defense sector overall. And what I want you to understand is that there are ample times, including what's happening right now, where the defense sector is actually counter-cyclical to what goes on in the overall industrial economy. You can see here the orange line is rising for defense, while the blue line is declining for industrial production. And this is just an example. There are other sectors like this that are out there that you really need to think about. How do I make sure my business is positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that are out there? And how do I not invest significant resources, time, effort, and money into sectors that are going to be more negative in their performance outlook rather than the ones that are actually going to give me, a better ROI for the investments that I'm ready to make. But all of this requires looking at the data in a way that is not just surface level, as we describe the person's outward appearance, but rather is indicative of the cycle of that particular industry, as we're doing so here in the rates of change. So taking this and applying that, for example, to something that drives a lot of empowering pumps and equipment customers and members, and that is, of course, CapEx spending. This is represented by a series called Non-Defense Capital Goods Excluding Aircraft. And so you can see here, again, similar messaging, the 12-month moving total by far at a record high. I mean, you can see here, it's so far above any of the previous peaks that we really are operating in a whole new environment right now. $900 billion, we're encroaching on that figure, which is just phenomenal. We've never even come close to that before. But once again, looked at on a rate of change basis, it's clearly showing signs of slowdown. It's not as negative as what we were seeing in this industrial production. So year over year, we're still up nearly 8%, quarter over quarter, 4.5%. The reason for that disconnect is that industrial production measures the actual volume of activity, whereas non-defense capital goods measures the dollars associated with that activity. So what you're seeing here is the influence of inflation on the dollars that is not shown in the volume metric that we saw in industrial production. So even despite the fact that we have had multiple price increases over the last 12 months at almost every single vendor that I can think of, we're still seeing that deceleration. So really, you can say that it is the inflationary component that is causing the growth in the top line of most businesses today, not the fact that they're actually busier in terms of volume as it compares to periods in the past. So keep that in mind. And of course, don't forget, you are in business to make a profit, not just to drive your top line performance. And so as these rates of change come down, be more conservative and more decisive in terms of pulling the trigger on investments. Seek the ones that are going to give you the return on capital that you want in an inflationary environment. It's not enough to just get revenue growth. You actually have to scale and get the kind of return on that investment that you are going to be able to capitalize on for the long term, not just in the immediate term future. So as you can see, when we look at the industrial environment overall, whether it's industrial production or CapEx spending, it is clearly slowing down and, as I alluded to earlier, likely to decelerate further. So we have a good sense of what's going to happen probably over the next 3 to 6 months, kind of into the latter part of this year. But how do we get a sense of longer term implications? Well, we do that by looking at things called leading indicators. And leading indicators, put very simply, are data series that have a consistent ability to predict what a different data series is going to behave like over a period of time. So in this case, I'm giving you an example of 2 different data series. One is a subset of industry data, and one is the leading indicator, as you can see in the orange. So how does this work? Well, if you look at the peak in this leading indicator that happened in the fourth quarter of 2009, that peak actually corresponds to the peak in the data series that you're trying to predict in the fourth quarter of 2010, a year later. So that implies that there is a 12-month lead time that exists between the orange line and the blue line. So the way that we leverage this information is, first, we need to validate it, right? Do we see this relationship hold true over the course of the data series? Well, here the low predicts this low, right? We can see that this peak predicts this peak, this low predicts this low, and so on and so forth. So it's consistently visible in the data series. Once I've established that relationship, I can actually look at the latest data in the indicator. Now, keep in mind, this is not a guess. It's not a forecast. This has already taken place. It's in the past. And I can physically manipulate this by shifting that entire line forward, aligning those low points and the high points, and actually leveraging the insight of what this series has already done to predict what the blue line is going to do. So it gives you a year's worth of insight into the directional momentum of the series that you're trying to predict. And you can use this with economic data. You can use this with company-specific data if you're so inclined. And even beyond that, you can separate your business by region or by vertical or by product type and look at the performance on the cyclical basis, identifying different leading indicators that will predict how different parts of your business are going to operate. So it's a very powerful tool. It only requires commitment and time. Most of this data is available in the public domain. And so if you're not already looking at your business and tracking those vital signs, as I already mentioned, you absolutely should start doing that. So let's apply this methodology that I've just shared with you to the industrial economy overall. Again, here we have the blue line. That's U.S. industrial production year over year. The orange line in this case is the total industry capacity utilization rate. That's a very fancy term, but it basically describes the amount of existing infrastructure, factory space, and machine capacity that we're using right now to meet the current level of demand. And as you can see, this has a 6-month lead time I've already offset it by that timing relationship, pushed it forward, in other words, and you can see it's talking about the propensity for the blue line to continue to decline and enter negative territory by late 2023, early 2024. When we look for leading indicators, it's important to not have too much emphasis on any one particular series. So you want to develop kind of a body of evidence, if you will, that will conclusively and holistically tell you what is likely to happen. So we want to look at least 3 to 5 different indicators to build that body of evidence. In addition to total industry capacity utilization rate, I like looking at copper futures as an indicator. And again, you can see here the cyclical relationship, the lows and the highs in terms of copper prices align quite well with that of the industrial economy. Now, the logic test, or the litmus test, if you will, for why does this make sense? Well, it's because copper is so pervasively used in so many different elements of the industrial economy, right? We make construction projects with copper, machines are built with copper, electricity is generated and transmitted via copper lines. So it's so dominant in its usage in the industrial sector that it actually is a good harbinger of things to come. And in this case, you can see I've offset it by that lead lag relationship, which in this case is 9 months. And you can see, again, it does talk about that decline, but it's also showing potentially some signs of improvement by the time we get into early 2024. This is why it's important to have more than one leading indicator for you to rely on and not just put all your eggs in one leading indicator basket, if you will. One of my favorite leading indicators, and one that is potentially saying, well, the weakness might last into the first quarter of 24, is the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index. Again, you can see very consistent cyclical relationship there. What I love about this particular indicator is it's got a 12-month lead time. And so this is saying all the way into the end of Q1 of 2024, don't expect any kind of substantial rise to emerge in the US industrial economy. And if you keep monitoring these indicators, every month of data, you can plot it and start to see when that turnaround starts to occur, giving yourself that much insight in advance before it actually starts to happen. Therefore, you can be ahead of the herd in terms of pulling the necessary levers to emerge out of the low point in the cycle earlier, and therefore kind of position yourself to capitalize on those rising trends sooner than everyone else, gaining market share and really being a leader in the marketplace. So I hope that using tools like leading indicators is something that you're already doing. But if you're not, don't feel bad. It's not too late to start. If you would like to explore this further and need to ask me some specific questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm sure Charlie will make my contact information available for everybody. But I think that this is a process that every company needs to follow and implement as part of its strategic initiatives. So we've talked about macro industrial landscape. We talked about leading indicators. Let's talk about a few other things that are so on top of everybody's mind. And the first thing is, of course, inflation. So inflation, we can look at it in 2 different ways. The first way to look at inflation is how we as consumers feel it. And that's typically represented by a series called the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. And this chart actually comes from a good friend of mine, Joseph Politano. He runs a fantastic newsletter called Apricatus. If you have a chance, check it out. But what it's basically showing is that today's inflation is largely reflective of the increase in the price of services. So because we are free to go about our lives as we are, and I mean, from going to a restaurant or going to the theater or any kind of public activity, it's typically sold out or at capacity. That one poor waitress that's running around trying to serve 25 tables simultaneously, none of which have been bussed in the last 3 months, right? All of that is very evident when you go out into the world, and it really is contributing the biggest component. Of the 6% inflation that we're currently running, this is like 4.5%. So it's by far the biggest chunk. And in order for us to see some cool down in this element of inflation, we really need to see some slack in the job market emerge, which is what we're starting to see. I'll cover that in the 3rd episode of this series in a little bit more detail. But as of right now, we've seen a lot of pullback in Energy prices, we've seen a lot of pullback in the cost of core goods. You can see that's contributing very, very little to the inflationary picture. Food remains persistent in its contribution, but it's not a big chunk of it. So we really need to address this services component if we're going to see those inflation numbers go back down to the 2 or 3% range that the Fed has as its target in order to stop raising interest rates, right? So this is the consumer side of inflation. The producer side of inflation, I think, is more pertinent to talk about from your perspective, because this is the way that your business feels inflationary pressure. And the good news here is it is also starting to come down. You can see it's been coming down since the second half of 2022. It still remains very elevated. So overall, producer price index, as of the latest reading, still sits at 6%. That means that how can you possibly remain profitable if you're not, unfortunately, raising your prices to keep up with this increase in the cost of doing business? And that's one of the things that's going to be very tricky for businesses to navigate over the course of this soft patch that we're expecting in the next year or so. Is you have to remain profitable. Your costs are still up, not in all areas, right? Logistics and transportation costs have come down. Material costs are starting to come down, but people aren't getting any cheaper. And there are other elements of doing your business that continue to get more expensive. So you have to be very dedicated to tracking your profitability, not just at the top level, but at the customer level and at the product level, identifying the areas that really need your attention and raising prices whenever necessary in order to maintain those profit levels that you need in order for healthy operation of your business. In some cases, that's actually going to mean having to walk away from certain customers. And I know that business leaders hate to hear that, but it is what's necessary in order for you to preserve the health and vitality of your own organization. You can't do charity work, particularly during a period of softer macroeconomic conditions, and you have to be very selective in terms of who and how you do business. So I'm not advocating for a straight across the board 6% price increase. By no means am I saying that. I'm saying you really have to dig deep, understand what's driving profitability at all levels of your organization. And whenever you identify areas that are behind the curve relative to where you need them to be, you have to act. And you have to act with decisiveness, even though it may be painful in the short term. Okay. The good news is that based on the supply chain environment, which is in this particular case is the Global Supply Chain Index provided by the Federal Reserve Board of New York, that's the blue line, you can see supply chains are improving and improving quite dramatically in some cases. Now, they're not back to certainly the levels of supply chain availability that we saw in 14, 15, 16, and 17, but they are starting to come back to levels seen maybe in 2018, 2019. The cool part about this is that the supply chain actually is a leading indicator for inflation. So if you look at where inflation is today, and it means that we're likely going to see that inflationary pressure continue to diminish over the course of 23 and into 2024. And so that should help some of that profitability element that I discussed previously. But at least as of right now, if you're still seeing price increases from your suppliers, you have to be able to pass those on to your customers in some capacity, not necessarily, again, across the board, but certain elements need to be addressed. We hope that the leading indicator is telling us the truth, and it oftentimes is, and that means that that pressure should ease over the next 12 months or so. So in response to all of this, what does the Fed want to do? Well, we had another meeting in March where they raised the rates by 0.25 percentage point, despite all of the banking fiascos that we saw happen during that month. But they also issued future guidance. And so what you're seeing here is they're starting to indicate that the era of rate hikes is likely coming to a close. Each one of these dots represents a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee and where they believe interest rate policy is going to finish each of these years. So we're currently between 5 and 5.25% right now, which is where most of these yellow dots are today. You can see there are more hawkish members of the Fed Open Market Committee that think we should raise further relative to where we are, and at least one person that would like to see a rate cut this year. But certainly the consensus opinion starts to trend downwards over the course of 24 and well into 25 in the longer term, setting expectations that we are likely going to start to see interest rate cuts starting next year, if not earlier than that. Now, Federal Chairman Powell is very careful to manage those expectations. And at that March meeting, he did say that they just don't see the ability to cut rates this year. But certainly it's something that they're paying very careful attention to, and at least are keeping in the back of their mind as they start to, as they continue to track the economic data and as they start to see that deterioration in economic conditions that we're now expecting based on those leading indicators that I shared with you. So all of the implications of the softening industrial environment, the coming down yet still stubbornly high inflation, both in terms of the consumer and the industrial side, and based on the Fed policy that we're seeing in response to that, basically, as we look out over the next 12 months, this is a survey from Bloomberg. They have about 30 different economists, both from small and large public institutions that they survey. And as you can see, as of March, the expectations are that the odds of recession in the next year are somewhere in the 65% range. So 2/3 of all economic pundits out there believe that there is likely going to be a recession. Most of them, I should say, think it's going to be relatively mild and relatively short-lived, 2 to 3 quarters. So again, don't let this paralyze you, right? You can deal with some adversity because you've done it before. You've gotten through previous recessions before. Think back on what you were able to do that was successful. What did you do that was not so successful? And learn from the previous challenges and opportunities that you were able to take advantage of. Because the last thing that you should do is just kind of adopt a wait and see mentality. The leading indicators don't lie. They're clearly pointing to further decline in the rates of change, to a recession in the industrial economy. And so with that in mind, I wanted to provide you with some concrete things that you can do to navigate the current macro landscape, particularly the industrial landscape as we see it right now. So first and foremost, kind of touching on the implications of that interest rate policy, I really want you to focus on optimizing cash flow right now. It's going to be very expensive to borrow money at this point. In fact, I'd assume that there are no cheap borrowing options available to you for the next 18 months. And maybe you'll be pleasantly surprised and they'll start cutting rates earlier. But the reality is, based on that projection that the Fed has issued, it's not likely going to be until 2024 when they start lowering those interest rates. And so it's going to be expensive. Most businesses right now, access to capital ranges somewhere between 8 and 10% in terms of borrowing costs. And that's a lot. It's very hard to justify ROI when the cost to borrow money for investment is that high. So if you have cash, great. Make sure you focus on optimizing that cash flow, because it's going to be king over the next year to year and a half. Another thing that I'd like you to do is really to narrow your focus. I talked to you about this when we discussed the rates of change. You really want to identify those portions of your business, whether it's by industry, by geography, or by product line, that are going to be outperforming others, and then focus your energy and effort and investment in those areas. So basically, cut the losers. You cannot afford to invest resources, time, and money on losers in a period of soft economic activity. I also want you to think about the standard products that you offer rather than the customized. It is typical that in periods of economic weakness, like the one that we're expecting over the next year, that lower and mid-tier products tend to outperform the higher cost, higher complexity, more design type of products. They tend to lead in terms of performance during periods of downturn. This period of lull might give you the opportunity that you need to reinvest in the build out of your ecosystem. That means channel partners, that means suppliers, that means potential customers, and look for opportunities for win-win scenarios within that ecosystem. Help each other. When you both win, it's going to be the likeliest positive outcome as we face this mild recession that's looming over us in late 23 and into early 2024. At the same time, I want you to understand that while whale hunting is important during this time frame, you should not walk away from business whenever possible. And that means both that no win is too small, and that whenever you have an opportunity to lock down business for an extended period of time, you should take advantage of that. What I mean by that is if you typically have, let's say, a contract that is 12 months in nature, ask the client if they're willing to sign a 24-month contract if you give them a bit of a discount to do so. What that's going to do is it's going to allow you to create that soft landing scenario for yourself instead of that V-shaped kind of sharp decline followed by a sharp bounce out of that. So for that type of activity, it is going to be your current clients that are going to be most likely to go along with something like that because they know you, they trust you, they know you're reliable, and that your products are good quality, and they're a good fit for their applications. So look for those opportunities to lock in business whenever possible. And if you do all of these things, I believe that recession or no, you're going to not only go through this period of economic uncertainty with confidence and strength, but you'll also come out of it better positioned for the future. With that, I'll end this series and turn it back over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Alex. And I love how you can tell us that we are going through a downturn, but give us solutions at the same time and kind of challenge us to look at our business and see what we can do to be profitable in this time. I love your suggestions. So thank you so much. And I look forward to circling up for episode 3. So if you're on this one, you've got one before this one. You just finished the episode 2 and looking forward to episode 3. So thank you again, Alex, for your expertise here, and look forward to the next one.